Hello and welcome to BBC News. I'm Celia Hatton. We start with some breaking news on the victims of the infected blood scandal. In the next few minutes, a second report by an independent inquiry will be released with more details on compensation for the thousands of victims. They'd been infected with HIV and hepatitis C through contaminated blood products in the 1970s and 80s. It's been described as the worst treatment disaster in the history of the NHS. Well, here's a timeline of the events that led us here. The inquiry started in 2018, reviewing thousands of documents and heard testimony from 370 witnesses. Then, in July of 2022, the inquiry chairman, Sir Brian Langstaff, made his first formal recommendation, saying there was a compelling case to make some interim compensation payments of £100,000. Those first payments were made as quickly as October 2022 to surviving victims and also to bereaved partners of those who died. But not everyone feels they've been recognised. Katie Walford's dad died after contracting HIV from NHS blood products. She calls herself one of the forgotten children of the disaster and hopes the new report will finally recognise wider family members for compensation. Here's what she has to say.
My dad, I remember his smile, and he was a rascal and he was cheeky, and I've learned over the years growing up that he was a flirt and he just loved people. We were made to believe, and it's quite common that a lot of people were made to believe that they themselves were either a dirty secret or there was a dirty secret in the family because you just didn't talk about it. It wasn't until I was about 12 years old where I was told the full extent of his health. It's very much always on the surface for me, that experience, having my dad taken away from me far too early. If I was to get some financial compensation from this, I'll be able to start rebuilding the memories in his name, to be able to know that Dad's here for this. He would have been an amazing granddad, and that's been taken away from me and my family. It's the recognition and having it documented, validated worldwide, and to make sure that this type of thing does not happen again. And there isn't going to be another 10-year-old out there who's going to have to say goodbye to a dad too soon.
Katie Walford. Well, Sue Threkall also lost her husband, Bob, due to the blood scandal. This is what she had to say.
Over that time, we have battled MPs, various parliamentarians, civil servants, the medical profession, the pharmaceutical company. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. It's just sad, isn't it? Because it's this life that I was living perfectly happily, and then it went, everything went. I would like the truth out there. I'd like to know that proper measures are put in place to make sure that this can't happen again. It was cataclysmic, you know, and it just ripped families apart, including mine.
That was Sue Threkall speaking there. Now, the statement from the interim report will be coming to us fairly shortly, but just to remind you, if you've just been tuning in, the long-running public inquiry into what's been called the worst treatment disaster in the history of the NHS is being, we're getting an interim report on that. It's been running for more than 4 years. And we can go to that statement now.
When hearings finished in Aldwych House in February, I told you that I would be making a further interim report about the framework for compensation before Easter. Today, the inquiry has published that report. It's an unusual step to publish recommendations about redress in advance of detailed findings, but I could not, in conscience, add to the decades-long delays many of you have already experienced due to failures to recognize the depth of your losses. Those delays have themselves been harmful. As you know, the government has recognized that wrongs were done and that compensation should follow, and made interim payments in October. I believe that the government was right to accept this. My conclusion is that wrongs were done at individual, collective, and systemic levels. I will set out the detail of what happened and why in my full report. But my judgment is that not only do the infections themselves and their consequences merit compensation, but so, too, do the wrongs done by authority, whose response served to compound people's suffering. This has been described as the worst treatment disaster in the history of the NHS, and we have much to learn as a nation to help ensure that people never suffer in a similar way again. I will be setting that out in my full report. Today's report is the culmination of detailed work on compensation. As you know, the government commissioned Sir Robert Francis KC to give independent advice on a framework for compensation and redress, so that the government could be ready for the findings of this inquiry. The inquiry has held hearings about it. Most of you who are listening to what I am saying have been fully involved in it from your different perspectives. Sir Robert and I agree on the fundamentals of the design. Today, I recommend that this compensation scheme should be set up now. It should begin work this year. I'm also recommending further interim compensation payments to recognize the deaths of people who have so far gone unrecognized, as I believe this is necessary to alleviate immediate suffering. It is a fact that around 380 children with bleeding disorders were infected with HIV. Some have died in childhood, but their parents have never received compensation. Children who are orphaned as a result of infections transmitted by blood transfusions and blood products, and sometimes lost siblings and other relatives too, have never had their losses recognized. It is time to put this right. Let me say a little more about the process leading to this second interim report. I alone am responsible for the judgments and the recommendations it contains. But my task in reaching those judgments and making those recommendations has been made immeasurably easier by the way in which all of you, from whatever perspective, have put in a large collaborative effort to help me get it right. I'd like to acknowledge that, to thank those of you who've given statements, evidence, documents, often despite the painfulness of reliving some of what happened, and give a special mention to those who've given support to others, building a sense of collective comfort and solidarity. So, what are the contents of the report? I record in the report that some of the milestones that eventually led to the government's acceptance of a moral case for compensation have been marked by the reactions from individuals in power when they have actually listened to people describing what happened to them and their families. So, the right place to start my report was with some of your voices. And that is where it begins. I urge those responsible for considering my recommendations to start there, listening to you and appreciating the depths of what you have experienced, so that they, like me, can understand why compensation is overdue. You can read more about my recommendations in the report. I'd like to add something here about 3 issues which I know have been of concern to participants. In relation to infection with hepatitis B, I recommend that hepatitis B should be recognized like hepatitis C and HIV. On the question of eligibility, I recommend ending the approach of a cut-off date with no exceptions. And, like Sir Robert, I'm recommending that support payments should be guaranteed for life. In addition, psychological support be made available in England as it already is in the rest of the UK. To give you but one example, the most recent expert psychosocial report received by the inquiry was about childhood bereavement. It concluded that the death of parents as a consequence of infected blood and blood products has, and I quote, significantly devastated a generation of children who they left behind. It must be right, not only to recognize people's losses through compensation, but also to provide the specialist psychological support not offered over several decades to people infected and affected. The next phase of the inquiry may prove difficult for many of you as the date for the final report draws closer. The closer it gets, the more intense may be the anxieties surrounding it. You may have had a foretaste of that when waiting to hear what I had to say in this report. After Easter, the inquiry team will once more be travelling to cities across the UK to give you the opportunity to ask questions and to talk to other inquiry participants. I will meanwhile return to preparing the full report, and rather like before we started hearings, the preparations must necessarily go on out of sight. As I said before, I can assure you that I will be writing the report as fast as I can, with the support of Ms. Richards and my team. The British Red Cross team, who've been with us throughout the inquiry and attended the hearings, are available to support you in the coming months. Please do not hesitate to call them. Many people have said that they find those conversations helpful. Lastly, it remains for me to thank you again for your support for the inquiry. Though the report is entirely my responsibility, the inquiry is very much a collective endeavour. Today is an important milestone on the journey to establish what happened and why, to learn the lessons of the past, and to make amends as much as we can as a nation. I wish you all a peaceful Easter.
Well, we've all been listening to the full statement from the High Court Judge, Sir Brian Langstaff. Well, let's cross live now to central London and our health correspondent, Jim Reid, who's been listening to the judge's statement as well. Jim, what did you make of the statement? How significant is this for relatives and for victims?
I think it's a very significant day for both those groups. I think it's worth going back over the background to some of this scandal. So there were two main groups of people infected with HIV and hepatitis C in the 1970s and 80s. One group had blood disorders, in particular the blood disorder Hemophilia. A second group receives a blood transfusion after surgery or after childbirth. A public inquiry has been going on in the building behind me since 2018, looking into the causes of that. Now, around about almost a year ago now, so last summer, the chairman of that inquiry announced for the first time there would be interim compensation payments made to roughly 4,000 victims and family members. Today, though, he went further. There was another recommendation that compensation should essentially be made permanent. There should be full compensation. Now, that will mean, for example, that people will be able to claim for the impact on their lives. If, for example, they weren't able to have children because of the infection they were left with, they'll be able to claim for that. If they lost a job because of the stigma of HIV/AIDS in the 1980s and 1990s, they may well be able to claim for that. Also importantly, he expanded the eligibility of this compensation scheme. So for the first time, the children of some of those who lost their lives could well receive interim compensation, as could the parents of children who were themselves infected. So that is also very significant, Celia.
Any response yet from the government to the findings of this interim report?
Well, no one saw this in advance, not even the government saw this in advance. We've only learnt about it in the last hour and a half or so. In the past, though, giving evidence here, the Health Secretary for England, as he was at the time, Matt Hancock, did say that the government would follow any recommendations set out by the inquiry. They've said more recently that there is a moral case for compensation. So even though this was just a recommendation from the judge, and the government will have to decide whether to go ahead and accept that recommendation, certainly from the language used in the past, it seems that that is probably very likely. For more on this, we're joined by Kate Burt. Now, Kate is the Chief Executive of the Haemophilia Society, which has supported many of the victims in this long-running scandal, Kate. I just wonder your immediate reaction to what you've heard today.
This is a significant milestone. Sir Brian Langstaff has said for the first time, wrong has been done on an individual, a collective and a systemic level, and this must be put right. He is calling on government to act, and to act now, and not to wait for the final report in the autumn, and that is significant.
I thought the language used about how quickly the government needs to act was very significant today. So he's making the point, I said, it will clearly take political will to do this quickly, but circumstances here warrant it. Coming from a judge, how significant do you think that kind of language is?
I think it's hugely significant. He makes the statement that people are living on borrowed time. We have had 4 decades of denial and delay by successive governments, and Sir Brian's very unequivocal statements today says this must stop, and he in conscience cannot be part of a further delay.
Now, one of the criticisms made by families when there was the original interim recommendation last year was that children in particular who'd lost both parents in some cases would not at that point qualify for compensation. Now, I'm right in thinking that some of that has now been changed and the eligibility has been extended to some of these groups. How significant is that for those families?
Very. It's an acknowledgement at last that children who lost parents and parents who lost children suffered unimaginable loss. So the financial compensation is one thing, but the psychological damage done to an entire community is finally being acknowledged.
You talked about psychological damage there. We're talking at a time that's very different from today. In the 1980s and to a certain extent the 1990s, HIV was, in particular, was a disease that carried a huge amount of stigma, as did hepatitis C to a certain extent slightly later on. I wonder if you can give us a sense of what it's been like for the families that you speak to, having to live through that, because you see examples of people who lost jobs, who lost relationships, purely because they were treated with this NHS product.
Yeah, marriages were destroyed, careers were lost, families were torn apart, and the stigma still survives today. I know of quite a few members of the haemophilia community who have not told their own families, let alone their network of friends, that they have HIV. It doesn't end.
Finally, can I ask you about what has to happen next? This is an interim ruling, but then the inquiry will go on and give final conclusions we're expecting in the autumn. What are you hoping for that? Because that is a much bigger report that we're going to get in 6 months' time.
Ultimately, Sir Brian needs to tell us what went wrong and why, and who is to blame.
Thank you very much. That's Kate Burt from the Haemophilia Society. Very significant day then, Cecilia, here in central London. This could affect, the scale of this disaster is huge. It could affect 30,000 families who were, either individuals who were infected or family members who had to support individuals who were often very, very sick after being infected with HIV or hepatitis C in the 1970s and 80s. I'm sure we'll have more from this throughout the day on the BBC News Channel.
Okay, Jim, thank you so much. Well, as we've just been hearing from you and the guest you've just been speaking to from the Haemophilia Society, we understand that the interim report has extended compensation for the first time to bereaved children of victims. Well, let's speak now to Tony Farrugia, who at the age of 14 lost his dad and other relatives due to the infected blood scandal. Tony, thanks for joining us. I wonder if you can just go into briefly to discuss how this has affected your family.
We've actually lost 5 members of our family. 3 of them were all brothers. My father and both my uncles were infected. My dad and my uncle were infected with HIV and hepatitis C, hepatitis B, and my other uncle was infected with hepatitis C, but we also had 2 other family members that were also infected with hepatitis C. 4 of those victims have died, my father being one of them, and only 1 family member remains alive today. The impact has been devastating. My father died in 1986. He was one of the very earliest haemophiliacs to die from HIV, and subsequently we've been losing family members right up until the last death was in 2012. So it's been affecting our family for the best part of 30 years. Every time a campaigner dies or one of the victims dies, it's a constant memory of what we've been through, and I'm sure it's the same for all the community, not just myself.
Yeah, what a burden, Tony.
It's ongoing.
I'm so sorry to hear of how it's affected you. What did you make of the statement today?
We welcome Sir Brian's report. It's a very comprehensive report, and we're very pleased that today children and parents will finally be recognised. I know it's not a quick process. I think a lot of the children, under the rules of how this is coming out, will have to wait until the final report comes out and the compensation scheme is set up. But as Sir Brian says in his report, this has to happen now, and we agree with that the government needs to move forward with the work and to get this scheme implemented and up and running for when the inquiry reports. My only alarm today is it doesn't appear that we will be given any legal funding for representation from our lawyers to go forward in this compensation framework. That's quite alarming. I think the average person in the street won't understand the detailed terms of this report or the framework, so I think it's very important for this community who are very damaged and very ill that we are afforded legal representation by our lawyers that have been with us from the start of this inquiry. So we welcome the report today. I think there's a few issues that we need to look over, but all in all, we're pleased with Sir Brian's work and the report.
Sir Brian did mention, though, the need to extend psychological support to those in England that's already been extended to the rest of the UK, those who have been affected by the blood scandal. Did you take heart by listening to that as well?
Yes, we did. I mean, there has been psychological support in place for certain groups. I mean, it was administered through the Skipton Fund. I mean, all the funds have now changed. Yeah, I think it's very important for the psychological report. I actually head a group called the Fatherless Generation, which supports the children who have lost parents to this disaster. And from the people I see in that group, yes, psychological support is definitely needed. But I have to say it's 30 years too late for a lot of people. And I think also as well there has to be. I've had counselling around 2013, and it was actually really difficult because I think one of the main issues for me was actually the counsellor had no idea that this had taken place, that this scandal had gone on. So I found it very difficult to have that counselling. Although the bereavement side of it helped, I still felt that this scandal had gone unnoticed, and I think it's very important for a lot of people involved that this comes out and that they're vindicated of we've been accused of being dirty and diseased. People have been stigmatised terribly, and it's had a massive impact on people's psychological well-being. So yes, it's very important that the psychological support is put in place. And if I could just say one other thing, it's also very important that the government respond to this report as soon as possible and now start to implement the procedures to put this framework in place for the final report. And I think that's where we are today.
Tony, I did notice that Sir Brian really directed his statement today at those who've been involved in the inquiry, those who've been affected by the infected blood scandal. Can you just reflect for a moment on the community of people that have formed around this inquiry? How often do you speak with other people who've been affected?
Well, I mean, I got involved. I mean, obviously, my family members were haemophiliacs, so we was always involved in the haemophilia community. More so for me was the Haemophilia Society had set up a memorial service around about 1991 for the haemophiliacs that had died. So we saw quite a lot of people there. I mean, they're a very kind group of people considering what they've been through. They're very resilient, and we're going to keep fighting. You know, we're going to keep pushing government to actually deal with this properly.
So let's talk about that fight for a minute, Tony. How confident are you that the government will follow through on the recommendations of the report?
Well, I'm not, to be honest. I would hope that the government will respond to Sir Brian's second report. Yeah, that's all we can do, is hope that the government will respond quickly and deal with this as soon as possible going forward. Like I say, whether they will or not, we really don't know. They're currently on Easter holidays at the moment, so I don't think we'll be getting a response to this report until probably sometime into the week after next. You know, maybe a government minister could come off his holiday today and give a statement. You know, they keep saying this is a very important issue. I think it's now time for them to now show us how important it is, and maybe to release a statement as to what they're going to do. But whether that's forthcoming today or not, I don't know.
Tony, thank you so much for taking us through your story and for giving us your thoughts on the report. Tony Farrugia speaking to us from London. Well, let's cross live now to central London and to Hugh Pym, our health editor, Hugh Pym. Hugh, I wonder if you can reflect first on how other countries have dealt with this kind of scandals. Are there any lessons there?
Yes, Celia, it's definitely an international scandal we're talking about here. The use of these infected blood products in health systems for the treatment of haemophiliacs and for other blood disorders and blood transfusions. But interestingly, other countries broadly acted much quicker than the UK to tackle this head on, accept that things had gone very, very badly wrong, and to deal with compensation. So, for example, Japan and Canada and Ireland have all had long-running compensation schemes for victims and their families. In France, actually, there were criminal prosecutions of some of those involved. And I think what's really frustrated and angered victims and their families here in the UK is a long-running failure of the government to accept the fact that there was wrongdoing by the state and that therefore compensation should be paid. And today's report is very significant in that, because the inquiry chair is saying that there was wrong done at individual and systemic level, and that compensation should be paid, and it's reflecting loss of earnings, loss of life chances, the ability to have a family, as well as injuries, and the ability to hold down a job. And the crucial thing is, Sir Brian is saying the scheme should be set up right now. There should be no further delays, even though his actual final report is due in the autumn. We're waiting a response from the Cabinet Office, but ministers have said before now that they will accept Sir Brian's findings, but the final report will be in the autumn.
Indeed, Hugh, this isn't over. This is far from over, isn't it? We're still waiting for that final report. Can you just take us through that process? What more does the inquiry need to do?
So what Sir Brian has said, the inquiry chair, today, is that this is his interim report which deals with compensation, and his assertion that this needs to be started now, not left till after his final report. But the final report in the autumn will set out a full catalogue of what he thinks went wrong, who was at fault, to what extent were individuals, doctors and ministers and the system as a whole to blame for allowing treatment of patients who came to the NHS for treatment for haemophilia or needing a blood transfusion and were then actually infected with HIV or hepatitis C or both. So I think his report will really try to get to the bottom of this very, very long-running scandal described as the worst treatment disaster in the history of the NHS, going right back to the 1970s.
Okay, Hugh, thank you for taking us through that. That was our health editor, Hugh Pym, taking us through the findings of that interim report on the blood scandal.